Before Shaka Zulu became a symbol of fear and discipline, he was evidence of something far more fragile: how violence, when organized and rewarded, reshapes not only enemies, but the world that wields it. This is not the story of a conqueror's rise, but of how survival hardened into doctrine, and doctrine into a warning history would repeat. Shaka's earliest memories formed not around shelter or certainty, but around movement, avoidance, and the knowledge that belonging could be withdrawn without warning. Born into a society governed by lineage, cattle, and recognition, he entered life without the protections those systems offered. His mother, Nandi, carried the burden of scandal, and with it the quiet violence of exclusion. Their presence unsettled homesteads not through force, but through discomfort, and so they were shifted from place to place, tolerated briefly and then removed. In these early years, Shaka learned that survival did not come from status but from endurance, and that attention could be as dangerous as neglect. Zulu society at the turn of the 19th century was structured around kinship and obligation. Authority flowed through recognized bloodlines, reinforced by cattle ownership and the ability to protect dependents. To exist outside these structures was to live without recourse. Shaka's childhood unfolded in this vulnerable space, where insult carried material consequences and where protection depended on personal resilience rather than communal duty. He absorbed the rhythms of rural life without the assurance that they would continue, learning the geography of flight paths and temporary refuge before learning the privileges of belonging. The absence of protection sharpened his awareness of hierarchy. Boys of recognized lineage moved with confidence, trained gradually for future roles within the military age-set system that organized Zulu masculinity. Shaka watched from the margins, close enough to observe but distant enough to remain excluded. This proximity bred neither romanticism nor bitterness alone, but a growing clarity about power. It was visible, structured, and withheld. He learned that authority was not abstract. It was exercised in who ate first, who spoke without challenge, and who was defended when disputes arose. Physical hardship shaped him early. Without a stable homestead, Shaka endured labor disproportionate to his age, herding cattle under harsh conditions, absorbing blows meant to remind him of his place. Hunger and fatigue were not episodes but constants, teaching his body limits long before his mind formed ambitions. Yet within this deprivation grew an unusual discipline. He learned to move quietly, to endure discomfort without complaint, and to read shifts in mood and weather alike. These were not heroic traits, but adaptive ones, honed by necessity rather than instruction. Nandi's presence remained central, both protective and isolating. Her determination to secure space for her son often deepened resentment from others, reinforcing their status as outsiders. Shaka observed how defiance invited punishment, and how silence could delay it. From her he inherited endurance, but also an understanding that social systems could harden against those who challenged their boundaries. Their bond formed under pressure, defined by shared exclusion rather than shared privilege, and it fostered an inwardness that would later shape his leadership style. Violence in this world was not constant spectacle but latent possibility. Disputes over cattle, insults, or grazing rights could escalate quickly, and young Shaka witnessed how swiftly order collapsed when authority was contested. These moments taught him that force did not arise randomly. It followed fault lines already present, revealing weaknesses rather than creating them. Such observations would later inform his insistence on discipline and preemption, but here they served only to reinforce caution. As Shaka grew, his physical presence began to shift how others perceived him. Strength offered partial insulation from ridicule, but it did not erase origin. He learned that competence could command temporary respect while lineage determined permanence. This distinction mattered. It suggested that power earned through action was fragile, constantly tested, and vulnerable to withdrawal. The realization did not embitter him into rebellion, but it seeded a belief that systems could be restructured if their assumptions were exposed. The Zulu world he inhabited valued cohesion above individual distinction. Communal stability depended on predictability, and those who disrupted it, even unintentionally, were pushed outward. Shaka's life embodied that disruption. His very existence challenged accepted norms, and so the response was not dramatic punishment but steady pressure. This quiet exclusion proved formative. It trained him to expect resistance and to navigate it without expectation of sympathy. By adolescence, the margins had become familiar terrain. Shaka moved through them with increasing confidence, understanding their dangers and opportunities. He had not yet articulated ambition, but he possessed something equally consequential, an internal map of vulnerability, both his own and that of the society around him. He understood where authority weakened, where fear operated, and where discipline failed. These insights were not yet weapons, but they were tools awaiting application. This chapter of Shaka's life does not explain his future actions, but it frames them. Exclusion did not predetermine conquest, nor hardship cruelty. It produced attentiveness, restraint, and an acute sensitivity to power's mechanics. Long before Shaka commanded men, he learned what it meant to be unprotected, and how quickly order abandoned those without standing. In that knowledge lay the foundation of a ruler shaped not by inheritance, but by the consequences of its absence. The environment itself reinforced these lessons. The rolling grasslands and seasonal rhythms offered little forgiveness to those without communal support. Droughts tightened resources, and abundance intensified competition. Shaka observed how quickly alliances shifted under pressure, how generosity contracted when survival narrowed. Nature mirrored society in its indifference, rewarding preparation and punishing exposure. This constant negotiation with scarcity instilled patience rather than impulsiveness, a readiness to wait and observe before acting. What mattered most in these years was not what Shaka lacked, but what he learned to notice. He learned how humiliation disciplined behavior, how fear traveled silently through groups, and how order depended less on tradition than on enforcement. These realizations accumulated quietly, without spectacle. They did not demand expression yet, but they remained present, shaping perception. When opportunity eventually emerged, it would meet a mind already trained to understand consequence, forged not in ceremony or privilege, but in the long, instructive quiet of exclusion. This foundation would endure, unseen but decisive, carrying forward into every choice, command, and silence that later defined his rule. Removed from his birthplace, Shaka entered a world where survival depended less on who one was born to and more on how one carried oneself under pressure. Exile did not arrive as a single rupture but as a gradual narrowing of options, a realization that remaining meant constant vulnerability. Movement became necessity rather than choice. With his mother, he crossed into territories governed by different leaders, each with their own customs, expectations, and methods of maintaining order. These were not radically foreign societies, but their differences mattered. Authority was expressed differently, enforced differently, and justified by means that contrasted sharply with what Shaka had known. In displacement, he encountered variation, and variation began to loosen the sense that tradition was fixed. The communities that received him were organized around military readiness rather than kinship purity. Lineage still mattered, but it no longer stood alone. Leaders measured worth through reliability, endurance, and obedience under strain. Shaka observed this quietly at first, absorbing patterns rather than challenging them. He saw how men were grouped, trained, and disciplined not as individuals asserting status, but as units shaped to function together. The emphasis was not on ritual display but on effectiveness. Movements were repeated until they became instinctive. Mistakes were corrected immediately, without ceremony, reinforcing the idea that cohesion mattered more than pride. Daily routines reflected this mindset. Training occurred at dawn, when bodies were stiff and minds unprepared, forcing adaptation through repetition. Silence was enforced during marches, not as punishment but as discipline, cultivating attentiveness. Shaka felt the physical demands keenly. Muscles strained, feet hardened, breath shortened. Yet there was clarity in the simplicity of expectation. Effort produced recognition, and consistency built trust. This was a stark contrast to the uncertainty of his earlier life, where effort did not guarantee acceptance and recognition was arbitrarily withheld. Leadership in these environments was visible and practical. Commanders shared the hardships of their men, enduring the same marches and shortages. Authority was reinforced not through distance but through participation. Shaka noted how this proximity generated loyalty rooted in respect rather than fear alone. Orders were followed because they worked, because leaders demonstrated competence under the same conditions imposed on others. This model did not erase hierarchy, but it grounded it in shared experience, reducing the distance between command and execution. Exposure to different forms of warfare further expanded Shaka's understanding. Combat here was not ritualized to the same degree. Engagements emphasized speed, coordination, and decisive action. Shields were used aggressively, formations adjusted dynamically, and retreat was treated as a tactical maneuver rather than dishonor. Shaka paid attention to how battles were prepared for and concluded, noting that success depended on anticipation as much as bravery. Victory came not from isolated acts of courage, but from disciplined alignment of movement and intent. These observations did not immediately translate into ambition. Shaka remained cautious, aware of his position as an outsider. He learned first by compliance, absorbing instruction without asserting opinion. This restraint was deliberate. He understood that premature assertion invited scrutiny, and scrutiny could lead to removal. Instead, he focused on mastering what was asked of him, refining his physical endurance and sharpening his situational awareness. Over time, competence began to shift perception. He was no longer merely tolerated, he was useful. Usefulness altered the terms of belonging. Shaka experienced a conditional inclusion based on performance rather than ancestry. This was not equality, but it was stability. It suggested that systems could be negotiated through contribution, that authority could be influenced by results. This realization did not erase the sting of earlier rejection, but it reframed it. Exclusion no longer appeared inevitable. It appeared contingent on rules that could be learned and, eventually, manipulated. The contrast between inherited authority and earned command became increasingly clear. Shaka saw leaders whose legitimacy rested on lineage struggle to maintain discipline, while others without prestigious ancestry commanded loyalty through consistency and effectiveness. The implication was subtle but profound. Tradition persisted not because it was immutable, but because it functioned well enough. Where it failed, alternatives emerged. Shaka began to understand power as adaptive, shaped by circumstance rather than sanctified by origin. Silence remained one of his greatest teachers. Long marches provided time to reflect on what he observed. He noticed how men responded to stress, how fatigue revealed character, how fear could be managed through preparation. He internalized the rhythm of disciplined movement, the reassurance it offered amid uncertainty. Order, he learned, was not the absence of conflict but the containment of it. Discipline provided predictability, and predictability reduced panic. These lessons embedded themselves not as theories but as lived experience. Exile also sharpened his sense of impermanence. Acceptance could be withdrawn as easily as it was granted. This awareness prevented complacency. Shaka understood that survival required constant adaptation, that no system guaranteed permanence. He remained attentive to shifts in leadership, alliances, and resource distribution, recognizing that stability was always provisional. This perspective fostered a readiness to change course when conditions demanded it, a trait that would later distinguish his approach to leadership. By the time Shaka began to feel at ease within these military cultures, he had already absorbed their underlying logic. Discipline was not merely enforced, it was cultivated. Authority was not distant, it was demonstrated. Warfare was not ceremonial, it was systemic. These insights did not yet overturn tradition, but they planted alternatives within his thinking. They offered proof that different arrangements were possible, that power could be reorganized around function rather than lineage. This chapter of displacement did not transform Shaka into a reformer overnight. It refined his perception, aligning his early experiences of exclusion with new models of authority. Exile became education not because it promised advancement, but because it revealed structure. It showed him how systems could be built, maintained, and adapted under pressure. When he eventually returned to shape his own society, he would not do so blindly. He would draw upon these lessons, quietly gathered in movement and silence, carrying forward an understanding forged not at home, but in the instructive distance of removal. Shaka's emergence as a military innovator did not begin with grand declarations or abrupt breaks from the past. It unfolded gradually, through close observation, physical repetition, and a growing impatience with inefficiency. The systems he inherited were not weak, but they were bounded by ritual, shaped as much by tradition as by necessity. Combat had long followed established patterns, with engagements governed by display, limited clashes, and conventions that restrained destruction. Shaka absorbed these customs fully before he altered them. He understood their logic, their symbolic weight, and their role in maintaining social balance. Yet he also recognized their limits. As political pressure intensified and competition for land and cattle increased, ritualized conflict no longer resolved disputes decisively. Violence lingered unresolved, returning again and again. Shaka's early experiences of instability and exile had taught him that uncertainty bred danger. Now, positioned within a military structure, he began to refine what he had learned, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire for clarity and finality. Training became the first site of transformation. Drills grew harsher, repetition more exacting. Warriors were expected to move as coordinated bodies rather than as individuals seeking distinction. Physical endurance was no longer assumed. It was enforced. Long marches hardened legs and lungs, stripping away weakness without apology. Silence during movement became a discipline in itself, sharpening awareness and reinforcing control. Through these methods, Shaka reshaped preparation into a test of total commitment, binding men to one another through shared strain rather than shared ceremony. Weapons and formations followed. Shaka shortened the spear, turning it from a thrown implement into a close combat tool that demanded proximity and decisiveness. This change was not merely technical. It altered the psychology of fighting. Distance no longer offered safety. Victory required entering danger deliberately, confronting an opponent directly, and finishing the engagement quickly. Shields became instruments of offense as well as defense, used to break formations and create openings. These refinements emphasized momentum and pressure, overwhelming opponents before they could recover balance. The battlefield ceased to be a space for demonstration and became a mechanism for resolution. Shaka trained his warriors to encircle, contain, and compress, treating the enemy not as an equal participant in ritual, but as a force to be neutralized systematically. Such tactics demanded absolute trust in command and cohesion among ranks. Individual initiative was subordinated to collective movement, and hesitation became a liability. Fear, once dispersed through ceremony, was now concentrated and directed. Warriors learned that survival depended on discipline, not bravado. This recalibration of combat transformed warfare into a structured process, where outcomes were shaped by preparation and execution rather than chance or honor. Through these changes, Shaka redefined effectiveness as the highest virtue, replacing symbolic restraint with calculated force. Psychological control became as important as physical technique. Shaka understood that discipline extended beyond the battlefield. Warriors lived under constant expectation, their routines regulated, their loyalty monitored. Rewards reinforced obedience, while punishment was immediate and visible. This was not random brutality but deliberate conditioning. Predictability replaced uncertainty, creating an environment where behavior aligned with command almost instinctively. Shaka's presence reinforced this order. He observed closely, spoke sparingly, and intervened decisively. Authority was embodied rather than proclaimed, communicated through consistency rather than spectacle. Warriors internalized his standards, measuring themselves against expectations that left little room for ambiguity. This internalization reduced the need for constant enforcement, allowing control to operate even in his absence. Fear played a role, but it was balanced by pride in belonging to a force defined by effectiveness. The warrior identity shifted accordingly. Valor was no longer measured by individual feats but by contribution to collective success. Loyalty became functional, tied to survival and advancement within a system that rewarded discipline. Through this structure, Shaka forged not just an army, but a mindset. Violence, once episodic and constrained, became continuous potential, held in reserve and released with precision. The transformation was quiet, incremental, and profound, reshaping social expectations as much as military practice. The consequences of this refinement extended beyond immediate victories. As Shaka's forces demonstrated their effectiveness, neighboring groups adapted or fled, altering regional dynamics. Warfare accelerated, compressing cycles of conflict and response. Societies organized themselves defensively, anticipating encounters shaped by speed and decisiveness rather than negotiation. Within Shaka's domain, the line between civilian and warrior blurred, as military readiness influenced daily life. Discipline radiated outward, structuring relationships and obligations. These changes were not framed as revolutions but as necessities, justified by results rather than ideology. Shaka did not articulate a philosophy of violence. He embodied a method. His innovations made conflict more efficient and therefore more consequential. They reduced the space for compromise while increasing the stakes of resistance. In refining existing methods, Shaka transformed the meaning of warfare itself, aligning it with a world where survival depended on adaptation. The warrior he shaped was no longer a participant in ritual balance, but an instrument of systematic force, bound by discipline and purpose. This transformation did not end conflict. It intensified it, embedding violence more deeply into social order. Shaka's refinements offered control and clarity, but they also narrowed the paths available to those within and beyond his reach. What emerged was not chaos, but a new equilibrium, sustained by readiness and fear, setting the stage for expansion and the strains that would follow. Military success altered the meaning of authority long before it altered borders. As Shaka's campaigns accumulated victories, legitimacy followed not as ceremony but as consequence. Men who had once measured loyalty through lineage and tradition began to measure it through survival and reward. In a landscape where defeat carried immediate costs, effectiveness spoke more loudly than custom. Shaka understood this shift intuitively. He did not announce it or formalize it through law. He allowed results to speak, and they spoke with clarity. Each successful engagement reinforced the idea that his methods worked, and that alignment with him offered protection in a world growing increasingly dangerous. The aftermath of battle became its own argument. Communities absorbed or displaced by Shaka's forces encountered not chaos but order, rigid and unforgiving. Warriors returned intact, disciplined, and provisioned. Losses were minimized, victories decisive. This predictability contrasted sharply with older patterns of conflict that resolved little and invited retaliation. For those observing from within and beyond his domain, the calculation shifted. Loyalty was no longer a matter of inherited obligation but a rational response to demonstrated power. Shaka's authority expanded through accumulation, each success narrowing alternatives until alignment appeared less a choice than a necessity. Within his ranks, the effects were equally pronounced. Warriors who had endured rigorous training and brutal discipline saw tangible returns. Success validated hardship, transforming suffering into proof of belonging. The bond between effort and reward tightened, reinforcing obedience not through ideology but through experience. Men followed orders because those orders led them home alive. This feedback loop deepened commitment, making dissent increasingly difficult to justify. To question Shaka's authority was to question a system that had proven its worth repeatedly, under conditions where failure meant death. As efficiency rose, moral considerations receded. Violence became normalized through repetition and justification. Shaka did not frame his campaigns as righteous causes. He framed them as necessary actions in an unforgiving environment. This pragmatism resonated. Communities accustomed to cycles of insecurity recognized the appeal of decisive dominance. Stability, even when imposed, offered respite from constant threat. Shaka's legitimacy thus rested not on moral persuasion but on the delivery of order. The calculus was simple. Those under his control faced fewer uncertainties than those outside it. This shift carried subtle consequences. Authority detached itself from shared values and attached instead to outcomes. Leaders were judged by results rather than restraint, by expansion rather than balance. Shaka embodied this transition. His command style left little room for negotiation or dissent, yet it delivered consistency. Over time, this consistency redefined expectations. Loyalty became transactional, grounded in the promise of protection and success. Tradition persisted in form but weakened in function, overshadowed by the tangible benefits of alignment with power. The psychological landscape adapted accordingly. Fear remained present, but it was joined by confidence in the system's effectiveness. Warriors trusted the structure even as they feared its penalties. This duality sustained discipline. It reduced the need for constant coercion, as belief in the system's capacity to win reinforced compliance. Shaka's presence amplified this effect. His reputation preceded him, shaped by stories of decisive victories and uncompromising standards. Authority became impersonal, embedded in the system as much as in the individual. Yet efficiency carried its own erosion. As results became the primary measure of legitimacy, moral boundaries blurred. Decisions were evaluated by outcome alone, sidelining considerations of cost beyond immediate success. Violence, once justified as necessity, risked becoming default. Shaka did not indulge excess for its own sake, but the system he led incentivized escalation. Success demanded continued demonstration, and demonstration required conflict. Authority, once earned, had to be continually reaffirmed through action. This dynamic altered relationships within the expanding state. Subordinate leaders derived their status from proximity to success, tying their fortunes to Shaka's campaigns. This alignment reduced internal fragmentation but increased dependence on constant momentum. Stability rested on continued victory. The system discouraged pause, as inactivity invited doubt. Efficiency thus became both strength and constraint, driving expansion while narrowing the space for recalibration. Shaka's legitimacy at this stage was unquestioned, but it was also conditional. It depended on maintaining the pattern of success that justified his authority. Loyalty grounded in results proved durable yet demanding. It required perpetual validation. The transformation underway was not merely political but cultural. A society accustomed to negotiated balance adjusted to imposed order. Authority centralized, justified by its capacity to deliver outcomes others could not. This chapter of consolidation marked a turning point in how power was understood. Shaka's rule demonstrated that effectiveness could override tradition, and that legitimacy could be constructed through performance rather than inheritance. The shift did not erase older values, but it subordinated them. In doing so, it reshaped expectations of leadership and obedience. Victory became argument, efficiency its own moral language. What emerged was a system coherent and formidable, sustained by results and indifferent to dissent. It carried within it the seeds of both stability and strain, setting conditions that would demand continual assertion and leave little room for retreat. As Shaka's authority solidified through military success, the disciplines forged for war began to seep into everyday life, altering rhythms that had once been governed by kinship and negotiation. What had functioned on campaign now shaped settlement, labor, and conduct. The boundary between soldier and civilian thinned, not through decree, but through habit. Communities organized themselves around readiness, mirroring the structures that had proven effective in battle. Order extended outward from the ranks, settling into homes and fields with the same insistence that had once governed marches and formations. Daily life adjusted first in small ways. Movement became regulated, gatherings monitored, speech measured. The silence once enforced on the march found echoes in communal spaces, where restraint signaled safety. People learned to read shifts in tone and posture, understanding that attention could attract scrutiny. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through observation. Punishments were rare enough to feel selective, but visible enough to shape behavior. This balance preserved stability while discouraging deviation. Compliance emerged less from constant threat than from the awareness that order was being watched. Administrative control relied on predictability. Shaka's system rewarded consistency and punished uncertainty. Civilians were expected to contribute labor and resources efficiently, mirroring the expectations placed on warriors. Food production, distribution, and storage became matters of oversight, not custom. This oversight reduced waste and ensured supply, reinforcing the perception that discipline produced security. Yet it also displaced older forms of mutual obligation, replacing negotiation with instruction. Authority no longer flowed through elders alone, but through appointed agents whose legitimacy derived from proximity to power rather than lineage. Fear functioned as a stabilizing force within this expanding order. It compressed resistance, discouraging fragmentation during rapid growth. People complied not only because punishment was possible, but because the system appeared coherent and relentless. Shaka's presence loomed even in absence, embodied in the routines that governed daily life. The predictability of enforcement created a sense of inevitability. Deviations were corrected swiftly, restoring equilibrium before dissent could spread. This administrative fear differed from chaos. It was calibrated, embedded within procedure rather than spectacle. Violence, when applied, was purposeful, reinforcing norms rather than indulging impulse. Yet its cumulative effect weighed heavily. Older social balances eroded as communal decision-making gave way to centralized command. Elders retained symbolic roles, but their influence narrowed. The locus of authority shifted upward, concentrating power while simplifying governance. The psychological toll of this transformation unfolded gradually. Stability brought relief from constant external threat, but it also imposed vigilance. People measured their actions carefully, aware that safety depended on alignment. Trust narrowed to immediate circles, while broader communal bonds weakened. Fear reduced conflict, but it also reduced spontaneity. Life became ordered, but constrained. Children grew up within this structure, absorbing discipline as normality. Play mirrored training, imitation replacing exploration. The environment itself seemed quieter, not from peace alone, but from caution. This quiet reinforced order, masking tension beneath routine. Shaka's system functioned efficiently, sustaining expansion and integration, yet it demanded continual compliance. Human cost accrued in subtle ways, in suppressed dissent, in strained relationships, in the quiet recalibration of identity. As discipline reshaped civilian life, it reinforced Shaka's authority while narrowing alternatives. The system delivered stability, but at the expense of older balances that had allowed flexibility and negotiation. Fear maintained order, but it also hardened it, reducing the capacity for adaptation. This chapter of governance revealed both the strength and fragility of imposed stability. It held society together during expansion, yet it embedded tension that would require constant management. Order endured, but its cost accumulated silently, shaping a world that functioned smoothly while growing increasingly rigid, preparing the ground for the pressures yet to come. As Shaka's power expanded outward, the speed of conquest began to outpace the slower, more fragile work of absorption. Territory fell quickly, often decisively, but people did not transform as readily as borders. The mechanisms that had proven effective in enforcing discipline and achieving victory were less suited to knitting together diverse communities with distinct customs, loyalties, and memories of autonomy. What emerged was a state formidable in appearance yet increasingly strained beneath the surface, its strength derived from dominance rather than cohesion. Conquered groups encountered an order that was efficient but inflexible. Military structures imposed clarity, but they left little room for adaptation to local realities. Shaka's system prioritized uniformity, expecting newly absorbed populations to conform swiftly to established norms. This expectation reduced ambiguity but also suppressed difference. People complied outwardly, adjusting behavior to survive, yet inwardly retained older identities and grievances. Integration was assumed rather than cultivated, its success measured by the absence of rebellion rather than the presence of allegiance. The logistical demands of expansion compounded this strain. Supplying armies across wider territories required constant extraction of resources. Cattle, grain, and labor flowed toward the center, sustaining momentum but deepening imbalance. Communities already disrupted by conquest faced additional pressure to support campaigns that offered them little immediate benefit. The efficiency that characterized Shaka's administration ensured collection, but it did not foster consent. Order was maintained through structure and fear, not negotiation, leaving compliance brittle. Movement across the expanding state revealed these fractures. Warriors passed through regions where silence replaced welcome, where obedience masked resentment. The landscape bore signs of transformation. Settlements reorganized, fields redirected toward provisioning armies, traditional authorities sidelined. The pace of change allowed little time for adjustment. Stability depended on constant oversight, stretching administrative capacity thin. The farther authority extended, the more effort it required to enforce, increasing reliance on coercion. Shaka was aware of these pressures, yet his options were constrained by the logic of his own success. Expansion had created expectations within his ranks and among allies. Victory sustained legitimacy. Stagnation threatened it. Slowing risked exposing vulnerability, inviting resistance from within and beyond the state. The system rewarded forward motion, even as it accumulated unresolved tensions. Integration lagged not through neglect, but because reconciliation required patience incompatible with perpetual momentum. Psychological distance widened between center and periphery. Those closest to power experienced its benefits and protections, reinforcing loyalty. Those at the margins encountered it primarily as demand and discipline. Their experience of the state was extractive rather than inclusive. This asymmetry eroded cohesion, creating layers of belonging defined by proximity to authority. The appearance of unity masked a reality of uneven attachment. The administrative apparatus responded by tightening control. Surveillance increased, punishment standardized. These measures preserved order but further reduced trust. Fear compensated for the absence of shared identity, but it also amplified alienation. People learned to perform loyalty convincingly while withholding commitment. Stability persisted, yet it rested on constant vigilance rather than shared purpose. Over time, this imbalance manifested in subtle disruptions. Rumors traveled quietly, alliances shifted cautiously. Resistance did not erupt openly, but it simmered beneath compliance. The system's rigidity left little space to address grievances before they hardened. Authority appeared unbreakable precisely because dissent remained invisible, contained rather than resolved. This containment, however, demanded continual energy, draining attention from adaptation. Shaka's leadership style, effective in war, struggled to accommodate this complexity. His emphasis on discipline and uniformity minimized fragmentation in the short term but limited flexibility in the long term. Integration required negotiation, compromise, and acknowledgement of difference, tools his system had sidelined. The very qualities that enabled rapid expansion now constrained consolidation. The state continued to function, formidable and feared, yet increasingly dependent on force to sustain coherence. Expansion without reconciliation created a brittle equilibrium, resilient to sudden shocks but vulnerable to sustained pressure. The strain was not immediately visible, but it shaped every interaction between center and periphery. Power held, but it held tightly, leaving little margin for error. This phase of growth revealed the limits of dominance as a unifying principle. Shaka's state demonstrated how strength could assemble territory quickly while struggling to transform conquest into cohesion. The imbalance did not signal imminent collapse, but it altered the character of the system. Stability became conditional, dependent on uninterrupted enforcement. What appeared unbreakable endured through constant exertion, its solidity maintained by effort rather than consent. The expansion had succeeded, but it carried within it unresolved tensions that would demand reckoning as the system continued to stretch beyond its capacity to integrate. As the reach of Shaka's state stabilized and external enemies grew fewer, the energy that had once driven outward motion began to turn inward. Victory altered the emotional climate of power. Where urgency had once justified innovation and expansion, security now invited scrutiny. The absence of immediate threats did not bring relaxation. It created space for doubt. Attention shifted from the battlefield to the ranks themselves, from maneuvering against rivals to monitoring allegiance. Power, no longer defined by momentum, became preoccupied with preservation. This transition was subtle at first. Commands grew more detailed, expectations more exacting. Deviations that might once have been overlooked as fatigue or confusion were now interpreted as intent. Shaka's system, built on discipline and predictability, had little tolerance for ambiguity. As expansion slowed, the consequences of uncertainty appeared magnified. Loyalty, once assumed through shared danger, now required confirmation. The very success that had unified the state began to expose its fragility. Shaka's psychological posture evolved alongside these conditions. He had learned through experience that authority rested on consistent enforcement. In earlier phases, discipline advanced progress. Now it guarded stability. The distinction mattered. Orders were no longer issued to overcome external obstacles but to prevent internal erosion. Surveillance increased not because rebellion was visible, but because it was conceivable. The possibility of betrayal carried greater weight than its evidence. Silence, once a tool of focus, became a sign scrutinized for meaning. The warrior class felt this shift keenly. Training remained rigorous, but its purpose altered. Drills emphasized obedience as much as readiness. Loyalty was tested through endurance and compliance rather than shared victory. The bond forged in movement and battle tightened into constraint. Warriors internalized caution, measuring words and actions carefully. Fear, previously directed outward, circulated within the ranks, shaping behavior through anticipation rather than response. Administrative practices reflected the same logic. Information flowed upward, filtered through layers of reporting that prioritized reliability over candor. Leaders at intermediate levels learned that survival depended on demonstrating vigilance. This dynamic encouraged suspicion, as displaying awareness of potential threats became a marker of loyalty. The system rewarded those who anticipated disloyalty, even when it was not present. In doing so, it created an environment where distrust appeared prudent and restraint risky. Violence adapted accordingly. Once applied strategically to resolve conflict, it now functioned as demonstration. Punishments served to reaffirm boundaries rather than achieve objectives. Their visibility reinforced compliance but also heightened anxiety. Communities accustomed to order now navigated an atmosphere thick with caution. Stability endured, yet it felt provisional, maintained through constant reaffirmation rather than confidence. Shaka's personal isolation deepened during this phase. The concentration of authority that had enabled decisive action also narrowed perspective. Advisors spoke carefully, aware that dissent could be mistaken for disloyalty. Counsel shifted from challenge to confirmation. This feedback loop reinforced existing fears, amplifying concerns about betrayal without offering corrective balance. Power became defensive not because it was immediately threatened, but because it lacked mechanisms to reassure itself. The state's earlier successes had depended on clarity of purpose. Now, purpose fragmented into preservation of what had been achieved. Progress slowed, not from weakness, but from caution. Every action was weighed for its potential to disrupt equilibrium. Innovation, once rewarded, became suspect. Change introduced risk, and risk invited scrutiny. The system hardened, prioritizing continuity over adaptation. For those living under this authority, daily life absorbed the tension. People complied as before, but the emotional register shifted. Where discipline had once promised security, it now demanded vigilance. Trust narrowed further, limited to immediate circles. Social interaction became measured, shaped by awareness of observation. The quiet that had accompanied order now carried undertones of apprehension. This inward turn revealed the paradox of Shaka's rule. The mechanisms that had built power were ill-suited to its maintenance in times of relative calm. Discipline without direction risked stagnation. Vigilance without threat bred suspicion. Violence, stripped of strategic necessity, lost its capacity to resolve and became instead a tool to freeze conditions in place. Progress halted, replaced by containment. Yet the system did not collapse. It functioned as designed, enforcing obedience and suppressing dissent. its effectiveness concealed its cost. Energy once spent on expansion and integration now sustained internal surveillance. Authority persisted, but its character changed. It guarded itself rather than advancing purpose. This chapter marks a decisive transformation in the nature of Shaka's power. What had begun as a force for reshaping the world now turned to defending its own permanence. Violence, once instrumental, became symbolic. Discipline, once liberating through clarity, became restrictive through suspicion. The state endured, formidable and controlled, but its momentum slowed. The focus on loyalty over innovation preserved stability while narrowing possibility, setting the conditions for a system strong enough to endure yet increasingly brittle beneath its surface. At the height of his authority, Shaka occupied a position that few could approach and none could share. Power, once exercised through proximity and demonstration, had hardened into distance. The structures that had elevated him now isolated him, filtering the world through layers of caution and restraint. Advisors who had once spoken freely learned to measure every word. Some withdrew, others disappeared, removed by suspicion or by their own instinct for survival. What remained was a narrowing circle, not defined by trust but by endurance within an atmosphere where certainty had replaced dialogue. Shaka's daily environment reflected this isolation. Movement around him was precise and subdued, governed by protocol rather than familiarity. Silence, once a tool of discipline, now settled into permanence. It was difficult to distinguish respect from fear, loyalty from self-preservation. Orders traveled outward efficiently, but information returned upward slowly, altered by apprehension. Each intermediary absorbed risk, shaping reports to align with expectations. The result was clarity without depth, coherence without texture. Decision-making adapted to this constrained flow. Choices grew narrower, framed by the need to preserve control rather than expand understanding. Shaka's authority allowed swift action, but it also discouraged contradiction. Challenges to his judgment were rare, not because they were unnecessary, but because they were unsafe. Over time, this absence of friction reduced perception. The system functioned smoothly, yet it concealed emerging weaknesses beneath its surface order. Psychologically, Shaka remained vigilant. The habits forged in earlier uncertainty persisted, sharpened by the knowledge that power attracted threats both real and imagined. Yet vigilance without perspective turned inward. He scrutinized loyalty intensely, reading signs in posture, tone, and timing. This constant assessment consumed attention, leaving less room to consider structural strain. Control over people intensified as control over conditions diminished. The isolation reshaped his relationship with authority itself. Power became personal, anchored to his presence rather than distributed through resilient institutions. This concentration simplified command but reduced adaptability. Decisions reflected immediate concerns, reinforcing patterns that had worked before, even as circumstances shifted. The absence of dissent eliminated corrective signals, allowing small distortions to accumulate unnoticed. Those around him adapted accordingly. Survival depended on anticipation rather than contribution. Advisors learned to confirm rather than inform, to reinforce assumptions rather than challenge them. This dynamic created an echoing environment where certainty felt reinforced even as foundations weakened. Loyalty became performative, expressed through agreement rather than engagement. Beyond the center, the effects spread quietly. Administrative systems continued to operate, but their capacity to absorb strain diminished. Without feedback, inefficiencies persisted. Local tensions went unresolved until they demanded force. The machinery of control compensated, but at increasing cost. What had once been flexibility hardened into rigidity. Shaka's solitude was not marked by absence of people, but by absence of trust. He commanded obedience, not companionship. The emotional distance mirrored structural distance, reinforcing a sense of separation between ruler and ruled. This separation insulated him from immediate challenge while exposing him to gradual erosion. The environment itself reflected this tension. Order remained visible, routines unbroken, yet the atmosphere felt constrained. People moved carefully, spoke softly, and avoided attention. Stability endured, but it was brittle, dependent on continuous enforcement rather than shared commitment. The foundations of authority, once reinforced through engagement and adaptation, now relied on repetition. In this phase, absolute control revealed its cost. By eliminating uncertainty, it also eliminated discovery. By silencing dissent, it removed warning. Shaka's power remained formidable, but its vision narrowed. The system he commanded still functioned, but it did so by habit rather than responsiveness. This chapter marks a quiet turning. Isolation did not weaken authority immediately, but it altered its relationship to reality. The ruler remained dominant, yet increasingly removed from the subtle shifts beneath his control. Decisions continued, effective in the short term, yet less attuned to long-term balance. The foundations held, but they did so under growing strain, unseen from the height at which Shaka stood. The final phase of Shaka's rule unfolded without the arrival of foreign armies or the shock of sudden rebellion. It emerged instead from a slower depletion, an exhaustion that settled into the structures he had built and into the people who sustained them. Fear had once been a unifying force, sharpening attention and accelerating obedience. Over time, that same fear became heavy, constant, and dull. It no longer energized action but drained it, turning vigilance into weariness. The system continued to function, yet it did so through habit rather than conviction, through momentum rather than belief. Daily life under Shaka's authority reflected this fatigue. Movements were precise but lacked urgency. Warriors trained with discipline, yet their exertion carried a muted quality, as if effort had become routine rather than purposeful. Silence still governed assemblies, but it no longer conveyed awe. It was the silence of restraint, of words withheld because they were unnecessary or unsafe. The atmosphere was stable, even orderly, but beneath that order lay a thinning tolerance for perpetual pressure. Psychologically, Shaka remained formidable, yet the costs of sustained control were evident. His vigilance never relaxed, but it increasingly turned inward. The effort required to maintain dominance over an expanding realm consumed attention and energy. Decisions multiplied, each demanding certainty in an environment where information was filtered and incomplete. The burden of command weighed heavily, not through visible doubt, but through relentless focus that allowed little rest. Authority, once a source of momentum, became a responsibility that demanded constant reinforcement. Among those closest to him, loyalty persisted but transformed. It was no longer animated by shared purpose or collective assent. Instead, it was maintained through endurance. Advisors and attendants learned to navigate moods, to anticipate expectations, to survive by minimizing exposure. This adaptation preserved stability in the short term, yet it eroded resilience. When systems rely on fear alone, they depend entirely on the sustained presence of that fear. Any weakening, any momentary lapse, reveals the absence of deeper cohesion. Beyond the center, communities absorbed the long-term effects. Administrative efficiency remained, but enthusiasm faded. Compliance replaced participation. People followed orders not because they believed in the system's future, but because they sought to avoid its penalties. This quiet withdrawal did not manifest as open resistance. Instead, it appeared as emotional distance, as a narrowing of commitment to the minimum required for survival. The state endured, but it did so with diminishing emotional investment from those it governed. The cumulative strain reached its peak during periods of mourning and ritual, when collective emotion was expected to align with authority. Extended demands for conformity exposed the limits of endurance. What had once been accepted as necessary discipline became oppressive repetition. The cost was not immediate rebellion, but a subtle recalibration of loyalty. Fear still restrained action, yet it no longer commanded the same depth of obedience. Tolerance thinned, not loudly, but steadily. Shaka's isolation intensified this process. Removed from candid feedback, he interpreted compliance as stability. The absence of open challenge reinforced the belief that control remained absolute. Yet beneath this surface calm, bonds had weakened. The system depended increasingly on enforcement rather than consent, on memory of past consequences rather than present legitimacy. Such systems can persist for long periods, but they become vulnerable to internal fracture, especially when leadership energy wanes. The end came not with spectacle, but with inevitability. Those closest to Shaka, shaped by the same environment of fear and discipline, understood both his strength and his limits. They recognized the exhaustion that permeated the system and the narrowing margin for continued control. Action emerged not from chaos, but from calculation rooted in survival. It was quiet, deliberate, and informed by years of proximity to power. Shaka's fall did not dismantle the structures he created overnight. Instead, it marked the release of tension that had accumulated over years. The system did not collapse into disorder. It adjusted, shedding the weight of absolute fear while retaining elements of organization and discipline. This transition reflected the nature of its origin: controlled, purposeful, and shaped by internal dynamics rather than external force. The inevitability of the outcome lay in the logic of intimidation itself. Fear can accelerate transformation and enforce obedience, but it cannot sustain limitless expansion without renewal. When fear becomes constant, it loses its edge. When obedience is extracted without reciprocity, it hollows out commitment. Shaka's achievements remained undeniable, yet the methods that secured them also constrained their longevity. In the aftermath, memory absorbed complexity. Shaka was remembered as a force of transformation, a figure who reshaped warfare, authority, and identity. Yet his end served as a caution embedded within that legacy. Systems built on fear achieve clarity and speed, but they exact a price that accumulates silently. His fall was not a rejection of his strength, but a consequence of its application without relief. The chapter closes not with disorder, but with a measured quiet. Power shifts, routines adapt, and life continues within altered boundaries. The inevitability of the outcome underscores the central truth of Shaka's story: that authority forged through intimidation carries within it the conditions of its own exhaustion. Shaka Zulu's legacy resists simple judgment because it unfolded across landscapes permanently altered by his presence and absence alike. Long after his death, communities still moved within patterns shaped by his reforms, remembering both protection and devastation. Warfare no longer resembled ceremonial testing of courage but organized exertion of force. Authority had been centralized, obedience standardized, and survival recalculated. These changes outlived the man himself, embedding his influence into daily rhythms of work, defense, and movement. Legacy here is not memory alone, but structure, carried forward even when fear receded and leadership changed across generations and territories shaped by consequence. Assessing Shaka requires acknowledging innovation without surrendering to admiration. His military reforms produced efficiency unmatched in the region, enabling rapid consolidation and deterrence against rivals. Regiments trained for endurance, formations emphasized cohesion, and command flowed decisively. These methods reduced uncertainty in battle and increased survival for those within the system. Yet they also magnified destruction beyond earlier limits. Violence became scalable, repeatable, and administratively managed. This duality defined his achievement. Progress measured in order and security, paid for through displacement, loss, and the normalization of extreme coercion that reshaped societies long after immediate victories faded into history and memory alike. Social transformation followed military change with equal force. Older balances of kinship, negotiation, and seasonal conflict were displaced by centralized authority. Identity shifted from lineage toward service, from local affiliation toward state belonging. This reorientation enabled coordination on unprecedented scales, yet it also narrowed acceptable behavior. Life became predictable but constrained. For many, stability replaced autonomy. For others, integration came through compulsion rather than consent. Shaka's system succeeded because it simplified complex societies into manageable units, but in doing so, it reduced tolerance for difference and dissent within expanding territories governed by fear, discipline, and relentless enforcement mechanisms over time. His influence extended beyond borders he controlled directly. Neighboring polities adapted defensively, militarizing or migrating in response to pressure. Waves of displacement altered settlement patterns across southern Africa, redistributing populations and intensifying competition elsewhere. These secondary effects multiplied his impact far beyond his lifespan. Even communities that never encountered Shaka's forces adjusted strategies in anticipation of similar threats. In this way, power radiated outward, reshaping environments indirectly. His legacy thus includes consequences he neither planned nor witnessed, embedded within regional instability and long-term transformation affecting economies, alliances, survival strategies, and political calculations across generations to come thereafter, persistently unfolding onward. Moral evaluation remains inseparable from outcome. Shaka did not operate within modern ethical frameworks, yet suffering under his rule was real and extensive. Understanding this does not require condemnation alone, nor does it allow absolution through context. Instead, his life demonstrates how effectiveness can obscure cost when measured narrowly. Order achieved through fear can appear justified while benefits endure. Only with distance does the cumulative harm become visible. Legacy demands this broader lens, balancing transformation against trauma without reducing either to caricature or myth, preserving complexity across memory, scholarship, and historical interpretation within Southern African narratives enduring today widely circulated. Shaka's story illustrates the limits of power sustained by force alone. Control created momentum, but it also required constant reinforcement. The absence of reciprocal trust narrowed adaptability, making the system brittle under strain. When leadership faltered, cohesion weakened rapidly. Strength without elasticity proved unsustainable. This pattern recurs across history, where rulers equate compliance with loyalty. Shaka's experience underscores how authority grounded solely in fear sacrifices resilience for speed, achieving dominance while quietly eroding its foundations over time, limiting succession, adaptation, and recovery when circumstances inevitably changed, leaving systems vulnerable to internal collapse or reconfiguration thereafter historically documented repeatedly across cultures. Yet to frame Shaka only as a tyrant is to misunderstand his historical moment. Fragmented polities faced escalating pressures from environment, migration, and competition. His solutions were extreme, but they emerged from real threats and structural vulnerability. He responded with clarity, decisiveness, and innovation unmatched by peers. These qualities explain his rise and his appeal. Legacy therefore resides in tension, between necessity and excess, between adaptation and overreach, between leadership that protects and leadership that consumes communities, resources, and futures under relentless demands for unity, obedience, and sacrifice imposed continuously across expanding territories during his reign, historically remembered collectively today. Memory of Shaka has been reshaped repeatedly by later generations seeking meaning, identity, or caution. Oral tradition, colonial record, and modern scholarship each reframed his life according to their needs. Some emphasized heroism, others brutality. These reinterpretations reveal as much about the interpreters as the subject. Beneath them remains a consistent core, a ruler who changed the scale and nature of power. His legacy endures not as fixed verdict, but as ongoing dialogue with the past, informing contemporary debates about authority, violence, reform, and responsibility within historical consciousness across Southern Africa and beyond its borders, persistently today still evolving slowly. In this sense, Shaka becomes a warning rather than a monument. His life demonstrates how strength can build order swiftly while planting seeds of eventual fragility. Power that cannot tolerate limitation ultimately limits itself. Control mistaken for permanence invites blindness to change. The lesson is not rejection of authority or discipline, but recognition of their boundaries. Stability requires more than fear. It requires legitimacy capable of surviving the leader who first imposes it and guiding succession, governance, and cohesion beyond individual will, ambition, or force, ensuring endurance through shared consent and institutional balance over time, history, and circumstance alike enduringly. The story closes not with judgment, but with understanding. Shaka Zulu reshaped a region through will, innovation, and uncompromising force. His achievements altered history. His methods constrained its future. Together, They form a complete legacy, neither absolved nor dismissed. His life endures as instruction carved into experience. That power achieved through domination alone carries limits as real as its victories, and that permanence demands foundations deeper than fear, rooted in legitimacy, adaptability, and shared humanity. Lessons preserved within Southern African history for generations seeking balance between strength and restraint across changing worlds, societies, and political realities continually unfolding forward endlessly.